things aren't always going to go right. When users start clicking on things and users start interacting with things, action calls may not execute appropriately. Expected behavior, hosted controls that you are expecting to load with specific functionality or specific items may or may not actually do what you're intending them to do. And because those problems sometimes arise, it's important to have an idea in regards to why that situation happened. And a lot of times what ends up happening is that's directly a correlation of parameters. It's not grabbing the right piece of information from the right hosted control, or it's not getting the right thing in the right context. And that's sometimes real hard to diagnose and troubleshoot. So in this module, what we want to do is we want to talk about two specific things. We first want to talk about the debugger and using the debugger to really kind of understand what's going on inside the application. We want to talk a little bit about what it's used for and what's some of the different functionality that's available to you through the debugger. Now, we're not going to get into a ton of the in-depth stuff because this is really more from an admin perspective when you start talking about somebody who wants to, testing scriptlets and action calls and things on a much larger scale. But I at least want you to be aware of what the options are around that. One of the key areas that we want to talk about in regards to the debugger is how you can work with data parameters. And so the other thing that we're going to talk about in this module is this concept of replacement parameters and data parameters inside the application and how those items can be directly worked with inside the debugger. And so we're going to talk about how data parameters and replacement parameters work and how they work in the context of Dynamics 365 data to control what is actually being displayed inside the application. So let's first talk a little bit about what the debugger is. The main purpose of the debugger is as an administrative control to allow people who have administrative rights to go in and do some baseline troubleshooting. There's a lot of neat functionality that it allows you to get, but one of the key things that it allows you to do is it allows you to see the replacement parameter options that you have inside the application and then the current values. And so when you start working with parameters and you start feeding things in, it allows you to see what those current values are within the application. It also allows you to see specific events. So it allows you to see things like, when the desktop ready event was initiated, when a hosted control was successfully loaded into the application. It allows you to see a list of the specific events that occurred when they were fired and the parameters that were associated with them. So again, if something doesn't work right, if something isn't executing in the context that I would expect it to, I can see that exact event, I can see what caused that event to fire, and I can see if it captured the information that it was supposed to. Same thing with action calls. Obviously, action calls, as we've talked about many times, that's what's going to open up the information inside the application. That's what's going to execute that actual functionality. So when an action call executes, there's going to be details about whether or not it was successful or whether or not it failed. And it may fail because it didn't necessarily have the correct parameters associated with it. So the debugger really allows you to go in and start testing and seeing what's going on inside the application. You can actually go into each one of your action calls and you can run them on demand and you can test them to see if they're working. You can run and test action calls and then save an action call. So you can kind of create an action call on the fly and then save it as an action call in the application. You can use scriptlets and you can test scriptlets to make sure that it's constituting and creating the right parameters in the application. But basically, you can see what's happening inside the USD interface in kind of a real-time scenario. So from that standpoint, it's a very powerful application in regards to what it gives you the ability to do. There is a specific hosted control type called debugger. Now, if you're loading sample data or even if you're just kind of loading the new implementation, the debugger hosted control has already been kind of created and configured. But if you didn't have it created and configured and you wanted to work with it from scratch, you certainly could do that. All you would do is create a new hosted control, call it debugger or something like that, go down into the Unified Service Desk hosted control type, choose debugger as the hosted control, and then specify where you want to display it inside the application. application. And then what you typically do at that point is you create a host or an action call, and then in that action call, you basically call the debugger as default action to load it in. And we'll show you that inside the demo, how it's actually loaded into the application, but you use basically the hosted control, specify where you want to display it, and then load it into the application using an action call. Now there's a variety of different ways that you can kind of constitute using the debugger within the application. Remember, we talked a little bit about it at the beginning. The debugger is a hosted control. So if I go into my application and I go into Unified Service Desk and I go into hosted controls, I can see that there is a debugger hosted control inside here that launches and executes basically the debugger functionality. Now the big difference with the debugger is considered a global hosted control, which basically means that it's available within the global context in regards to whatever it is that you're trying to work with. So out of the box, if I wanted to go into the debugger, I can see that this is kind of a global hosted control, and then there's basically just an action call created within the context of the application that initiates the default action on the debugger, which basically just opens up the debugger. Now there's a couple of different ways that from inside the Unified Service Desk that you can associate that. You could create and call the action call from a specific button on a toolbar if you wanted to, or on the actual application, if I go into kind of my settings area, there's a debug option. And this is going to open up the debugger inside the actual Unified Service Desk application, and then I can click on it from here. And so this is the debugger. Now what the debugger basically shows us is what's going on within the context of the application itself. And so this actually goes in and it looks at all of my different action calls that have taken place as I've actually worked through the application. So when I've loaded a CRM page, when desktop ready, it looks at everything that's kind of taken place within the context of the application, and it tells me if there's any issues with it. If I have something that is setting an item, so in this case, if it's going ahead and it's expanding something or setting something within that situation, I can see if I had items that didn't necessarily work the way that they were intended to. I could see that properties didn't necessarily get populated. And if I have a red option down here, in here it's trying to do a do search, and it's telling us it couldn't do a do search because we didn't have a primary contact. So if you're trying to work with something and something doesn't seem to be initiating the way that you want it to within the context of the application, the debugger is where I can start to really kind of shoot down and see what's happening. So what I usually tell people to do within the context of whatever it is that you're trying to kind of work through is you basically just go in, run through your specific action, see what's taking place within that option. If it doesn't work, then fire up your debugger, open up the debugger, and then move through this specific event and see what's actually caused that particular item to work. And now you can see that maybe in this particular situation, it didn't fire off the way it was supposed to because it was missing a parameter. So then I could go into the action call, I could update the action call, and then facilitate that information from there. So the debugger is a great way that you can kind of facilitate what's happening inside the application. So here I can see what's kind of gone into this situation. It didn't expand these elements because there was nothing for these items to be expanded upon based upon the item that it's gone in. So in here it showed me what specific items it's loaded into the hosted control itself and then maximize the window. So I can see that the desktop ready event fired. I can see that it maximized it based upon that action call. It then went in and tried to expand the left and the right pane, but it couldn't because there was no session information loaded into that option, which is why we got kind of that item into here. Then it went into the next action call and it tried to load the individual dashboards within that option. As it loads those dashboards, then I get a specific option on each one of those dashboards that tells me what it's doing. So here's the events that triggered those particular functionalities. And then I clicked on the debugger, and now that showed me that it initiated the debugger in the application. So now let's just show you this kind of in context. If I go into search now and I click on AdventureWorks again, now, if I go back into my debugger, I can see as it's gone through now with my debugger, and I'm just going to re-minimize stuff here. and I go down, now I've got a whole other different situation here that's kind of populated in. So it first went in to my items as it's gone in and it's loaded that information. It's now gone in, I've done my search, it looked for my multi-entity search, it showed me that it was looking through the item, it found the item that it was going to go through, it initiated the page on the search, it loaded the page, it then went into my items, created my session, loaded my session, looked to see which specific agent script it should load, and it didn't load these particular items here because it wasn't in the context of a task, an email activity, or a phone call. And that's fine. Just because they're yellow doesn't necessarily mean that it's a problem. It's just telling you that it was not applicable or that there were not parameters available for that particular functionality to take place. But now you can start to see why things might be doing what they're doing or not doing in regards to the application itself. Now, as you get a little bit more advanced with this, the other thing that this debugger allows you to do is it allows you to go in and actually test these action calls. So I would be able to go in, pick specific action calls within here, and then test those functionalities to see if they're working or not working within the context of the application. I also could test scriptlets from here in some of those items as I get a little bit more advanced. The other options that I have within the debugger is I have all my debug output. So this is information that I can use to, if things are not working the way they're supposed to, this is where I could attach to this debug output using like Visual Studio, and I could actually do some debugging of code if I was a developer and wanted to work with items from there. The other key thing that you'll see within here, and one of the major reasons I brought you in here for the context of this course, is this data parameters. So what this data parameters is going to do is this data parameters is going to show you specific information in the context of what it is that you're doing. So as you've gone in and worked through different items within the application, the debugger is going to show you what's currently loaded into the application. So I clicked on Adventure Work Cycles and it populated Adventure Work Cycles, and I can see that different parameters have now been populated into here based upon those options. And we're going to look and explore that a little bit more here over the course of the next few slides and few lessons, so we'll talk more about this. But the key things that you'll see from a debugger perspective as it pertains to kind of the introductory training that we're doing here today is what action calls and events are being initiated within the application, and then ultimately what data parameters are being loaded into the application as well. So now that we've seen data parameters just a little bit inside the application, before we move forward and start working with them in the debugger, let's take a step back and let's talk about what data parameters and replacement parameters are. Because you're going to hear this a lot inside Unified Service Desk, and a lot of times the terminology gets used interchangeably. People refer to data parameters and replacement parameters as kind of the same thing. And they're not. They work in conjunction with each other to achieve behavior property as far as the application goes. But really they're a mechanism to be able to share data between individualized components. And so if you think about, like properties or how things work, the thing that's nice about data parameters and replacement parameters is even when you close a control. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and load the account hosted control. And when I load the account hosted control, it's going to load the company, A-Datum Company. So once it loads A-Datum Corporation into that hosted control, when I close that hosted control, the information for A-Datum Corporation still exists. It's still inside the application within that session. And so what's nice about that is the system now realizes that we used A-Datum Corporation inside that hosted control, and it gives me a mechanism to be able to share that with other aspects of the application. A lot of things like scripts and agent scripts and action call parameters and session names and all these different things that are being populated inside the application use data parameters and replacement parameters to facilitate that. And so they really are a critical piece to what you would do inside the application. Even if you create your own custom hosted controls, you can capture and use data parameters from inside those hosted controls to facilitate inside the application. So it really allows you to pass that context information over. And that's really what we want to talk about here for kind of the remainder portion of this particular item. So let's talk just a little bit about replacement parameters first. So the replacement parameter is really the syntax that you want to, that kind of defines what it is that you want to replace. So here's a really good example from an agent scripting standpoint. If you look up at the top, we have two parameters in here. We have the first one, which is going to be the username, and we have the second one, which is going to be the name of the contact that we're going to work with. So at runtime, these parameters are going to get replaced inside the application. It's going to go out and it's going to look for who the user is that's currently logged into Unified Service Desk, and it's going to look for the contact record that's being displayed inside the application. And so then what happens is when the application or when this instance runs, it goes out and looks for an applicable data parameter to actually replace that item at that particular point in time. So you define the replacement parameters inside the application and say, this is what I want to replace, and this is where I want to get it from. So in this case, the replacement parameter is going to grab the first name from the user who's logged in, and then their first name. It's going to grab the full name of the contact from the contact hosted control, and then the full name of the contact at that point. Now, that's the replacement parameter piece. The data parameter piece are the actual values that get populated inside the application. And we saw this a little bit when we were in the debugger. And that was why we kind of introduced the debugger and data parameters together. When I go into the debugger, I can look at all the data parameters that are currently loaded into the system. And now these data parameters might be associated with a specific hosted control. These data parameters might be associated with a user. They might be associated with a system resource or a session, any number of different situations. But the thing that's different about these data parameters is these data parameters change as I'm actually going in and using the application. So as I navigate to a different record inside USD, my data parameters are going to change, and it's going to load in the most current version of those data parameters. And these are what are ultimately getting populated. Let me give you kind of another example of this. So here's kind of the all-encompassing situation. So I have my replacement parameter, that is the account name coming, or the name of the account coming from the account hosted control. My data parameter has been loaded into the application, and the data parameter, as I can see here, is the name, which is a string value, which is loading in a datum corporation. So at runtime, when the application loads that specific hosted control, the account name field is going to get replaced with a datum corporation. So it's going to look at the context of the item that's getting pulled in, grab that specific field, and that's what's going to get populated when that hosted control or that item comes in. So a lot of your action calls that we've seen up until this point have these different data parameters associated with it. These replacement and data parameters are really what makes the personalized experience or makes the Unified Service Desk client do all the fancy things that it really has the ability to do from inside the application. Here's another real good example from kind of a practicality standpoint. So we've talked a little bit about agent scripts to this point. Agent scripts are an area that use replacement parameters all the time. So here's a real good example. I have an agent script which is going to run when somebody goes in to open up or kind of works through an account session. So this script is the welcome to account session scenario. Inside the script text, I have welcome, and then I have the name of the account. And then I have, thank you for contacting Woodgrove Bank. My name is, and then it's pulling in a user parameter, and then it's asking you how I can help. So what's going to happen is, as an agent, when I go ahead and I click on that account, the agent script is going to load in, and it's going to pass data parameters across into those replacement parameters. And it's going to understand that, okay, Derek has clicked on the AdventureWorks sample account, so it's going to then populate this agent script with, welcome AdventureWorks sample. Thank you for contacting Woodgrove Bank. My name is Derek. How can I help you? So this is a really good example from a practicality standpoint, how you might see that, facilitate that with inside the application. Now this is just one example. We'll show you a few more as we populate into this individual scenario moving forward. A lot of times when you're working with these replacement and data parameters, a lot of times when it tries to evaluate a replacement parameter, if there's nothing there to evaluate, so if something hasn't been brought into the context, or if there's not a data parameter to supply that option, it just kind of skips it. And you'll see that when we talk a little bit about session lines and some of those different situations. So one of the things that you sometimes have to think about from within the application is different scenarios that might come into play that might affect what it is that you're working with. For example, we talked a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about scriptlets. A lot of what you might want to do inside the Unified Service Desk will use JavaScript to be able to parse out and facilitate specific data parameters within the application. Well, a lot of times when you start talking about JavaScripts in different scenarios, there's special characters that come into play that recognize it as a JavaScript, which might interfere with what you're trying to do from a data parameter standpoint. Same thing with URL strings. There's a lot of special characters inside URL strings that might interfere with what it is that you're trying to do when you're populating specific situations from an application perspective. So they understand that that's really a scenario that could come into play as part of Unified Service Desk. So they give you some different options around these data parameters to represent specific circumstances that they may encounter. So one of them, for example, is the plus sign. So if you use the plus sign, that actually makes that an optional data parameter. So for example, if I have a contact name or an account name, and I may not always have that, by simply including the plus sign after the data parameter, now I make that optional and say, okay, if I don't have it, don't skip it, just leave it blank or leave it empty within that situation, so I know that I want to go ahead and utilize that or have a situation in there, but I want to leave it optional. There's also ones for like the $ for special characters. So if it has a scenario where you're bringing JavaScript into your scenario, if you use the $, it'll actually parse out the JavaScript specific code from that particular scenario and only extract like the contact name or the account name, so you don't run into situations where it's bringing that information in there. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility. Now you have that, what you see here are just a few of the options. We have one for escaping situations using XML or XAML. You'll use XML or XAML a lot when you start working with session lines. So if you have people who are building different session overview lines, they use a lot of that information, so it's critical sometimes to escape that information out. A lot of times you might be populating a URL and you might want to use components of that URL as a data parameter. This gives you the capabilities to escape some of that information. So here's kind of a nice example of what you would see in this situation. I'm going to use a script that's going to say hello to a specific contact. If the contact exists, it's going to go ahead and use the contact name. If the contact doesn't exist, it's just going to be an empty type situation. So it gives you the capabilities to populate that. Another scenario where you might use these options is to dynamically populate buttons within the application. So I have a JavaScript that is going to go out and populate information using a XAML scriptlet in order or using a XAML button using some kind of scriptlet. In this situation, it's going to parse out kind of that XAML coding information and just get the underlining text. And so it's a little above and beyond what we wanted to talk about from the context of this course, but it's also important to understand, particularly from the optional standpoint, that you're going to have to look at the situation in which that replacement parameter is being used, and then correspondingly pick the appropriate parsing option or special characters to make sure that you're getting only the information that you want from that particular standpoint. Now we've talked about hosted controls a lot up until this point, and one of the scenarios that we talked about from a hosted control standpoint is that concept of a CRM page hosted control. And that's very specific to CRM functionality, which is going to load all of that specific items around Dynamics 365 functionality and loads it into a specific session. Now, there's a couple of things that you need to understand around data parameters when you use the CRM page hosted control type. What ends up happening is you're actually going to get kind of 3 areas for data parameters, and they're going to look very, very similar, but they're going to populate into the application. So you're going to get, for example, let's say I'm going to load the contact entity into a hosted control called contact. when I go in and look at the data parameters inside the debugger, and we'll show you this here in just a little bit as well, what ends up happening is I'm actually going to see three specific elements. I'm going to see one for contact with a lowercase, I'm going to see one for contact with a uppercase, or in this case, contact with an uppercase, and then I'm going to see one with kind of a contact, hashtag contact. And the reason why that's important is because it treats each one of these individual situations very, very differently. So let's move on to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about that. So why do you get three options? So the first thing that you're going to see there is, let's talk about kind of the smaller case one. So the type. So let's go back into this slide here and look at kind of the smaller case version of the contact. That is in essence, at its simplest form, that is looking at the entity or the data from the actual entity itself that had gotten brought into that particular application itself. So for example, if I am going in and I want to load information from the contact entity, the data information is going to be shown in that smaller scenario. So when I look at it at a small scenario, that's the actual record that was coming from the entity, or the actual data that was loaded in from that particular type or that entity within the application. The one with the capital C is basically the hosted control. So that shows the last data that was loaded into that specific hosted control. Now remember, a hosted control, even though I call it contact, doesn't necessarily mean that contact information is going to get loaded into that hosted control. I might initially load a contact into there, but I might click on something that loads up an account or a case, and depending upon how my navigation rules were structured, it may load that inline. So in essence, the last information loaded into that hosted control was a contact or was an account, even though it was technically the contact hosted control. So basically what you're seeing in that scenario from a type standpoint is the contact with the small, the type one with the small c is the last contact record that was loaded into that session. The one with the capital C is the last data that was loaded into that hosted control, no matter what it was, even if it was an account. And then the one with both that has the hosted control and the type, that is going to go in and that's going to show you the last item of that specific entity type that was loaded into that hosted control. So for example, if I have an account hosted control and then I click on the primary contact, it's going to open that primary contact in that same hosted control. I'm going to have two entries in there from a both perspective. I'm going to have the account hashtag account, and I'm going to have account hashtag contact. The first one is going to show me the last account loaded into that account hosted control. The other one is going to show me the last contact loaded into that hosted control. Now why that's important is because these are the data parameters that you're ultimately going to pass the context to within the application itself. And so if my goal is to go out and show the primary account, I may not want to use the type. I may want to use the hosted control to pull that information in there. That way, if I'm going in and using the type, I might be able to use an alternate account in a same situation. So this is where understanding how those individual items are really going to play together correspond with that. So here's an example. So if I start by going out and showing an account in a hosted control called customer, and then I click on the primary contact, and I have that primary contact open in the same tab, this is what I'm going to see inside that situation. I'm going to see underneath the account option, I am going to see the account name, because from the account type standpoint, that would be able to pull in the name of the account that I last worked with. The contact would allow me to reference the contact full name, which would allow me to pull in the name of the contact that I'm working with. If I use the hosted control, in this case customer with the logical name, it is going to pull in the contact information because the contact was the last thing that was loaded into that customer hosted control. And then from a both perspective, I can see the customer account name shows me the last account loaded into there, and then customer contact shows me the last contact name. This gets a little tricky sometimes, but this is key to understanding exactly what you want to load into the system. So here we can see kind of a screenshot of that concept or that item in place. So I can see here that I have three different options. I have my contact that represents the hosted control called contact. I have the contact that represents the type or the reference to the contact entity. And then I have the contact hashtag contact, which represents the last contact record that was loaded into the contact hosted control. Now, what I want to do is take you into the debugger, and I want to show you exactly how this works. And we'll load a couple of options in there. The key thing I want to show you before we go in and load this is to remember that the information in the debugger, when we start working with data parameters, is not automatically updated. Anytime I make a change or anytime I load another record into the application, the data parameters basically need to be refreshed. So I'll refresh that, but then you'll start to see inside that exact same session how all that information is working. So in addition to what we've talked about to this point in regards to the three items, the items associated around the hosted control, the entity type, and then the last entity type record loaded into that hosted control, inside your data parameters, when you look at them through the context of the debugger, you're going to see a variety of other replacement parameters that can be used within there. You're going to see things like the context and the global and the scriptlet in the session. And these are individual context-based things that you could now also pull in. So we've seen a few examples where we've pulled information in from the user. Well, the user parameter basically loads information from that user record from inside Dynamics 365. The context record, if you have kind of an external hosted application or a custom developed CCA application that you've created, will actually store context information about that particular item. So these are also items that you can look at inside those data parameters. Now what I want to do is I want to go back into the debugger here real quick, and I want to, now that we've talked about all these different elements, I just want to talk about a few other things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through. So let's kind of start at the beginning here a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close out of this AdventureWorks option here. And I'm going to refresh my data parameters. So the first thing you have to remember when you start talking about working with data parameters from inside Unified Service Desk is they do not refresh automatically. So if you're trying to figure out what's specifically loaded in there so you can kind of determine if you're pulling the right parameter or replacement parameters inside your action call, you do need to refresh it as things occur inside the application to kind of work with it. So here I'm seeing kind of just my generalized information. I'm seeing the global, I'm seeing the session information, so this gives me information about the session, how many active sessions I have open within the application, if they're a global session. If I go into user, I can see all the information about the particular user that's loaded into this item. And then I can look at additional items in regards to what they're working with. So I can look at knowledge-based search, basically anything that will have been loaded from a global context within the application as I go through. But I don't see anything in regards to a specific account or a contact or anything like that because I really haven't done anything inside the application. So let's initiate that a little bit. So now I'm going to go into a search. And again, just because that's the one that we've been working with the most often, we'll do AdventureWorks again. And I'm going to click on AdventureWorks. Give it just a sec to load. Now I'm going to go back into the debugger. And just for space purposes here, I will collapse things. Now I'm going to refresh this. And you're going to notice that a whole bunch of other stuff now shows up. Here's those three elements that we last talked about. So the account option, this is showing us the last record that was loaded into the account hosted control. So in this case, it's AdventureWorks sample. So I can see in this particular situation, it's showing me the address for that account. It's showing me all the individual situations. It's showing me the name of the account. It's showing me the information that was last loaded into that hosted control. If I click on the event or the entity type with the lowercase, I get the same record because I've only worked with AdventureWorks cycles. So from a hosted control standpoint, AdventureWorks cycle was the last record loaded into the hosted control, and from an entity type standpoint, AdventureWorks cycle was the last account loaded into the system. And if I look on this third one, where it's the hosted control and the entity type, it's the same thing. It's AdventureWorks cycles, because again, AdventureWorks cycles was the last one that we did. Let's expand on this a little bit. So now I'm going to go into AdventureWorks. I'm going to click on AdventureWorks, and I'm going to click on the primary contact, who is Nancy Anderson. And we can see that Nancy Anderson loads up in line because we don't have any navigation rules that are routing this to a pop-up window or anything like that. So she loads up in line in this same account hosted control. So now if I go back into my debugger, and I refresh my parameters on my debugger, I'm going to see some different situations. The first thing is if I go into the account, which is the hosted control, and I expand the hosted control, I can see that the person that the data loaded into this right now is Nancy, because Nancy was the last record loaded into the account hosted control. Even though she was a contact, she was the last record loaded into this hosted control. If I go to the account entity type and I expand it, I'm still going to see AdventureWorks sample as the last item loaded into here. Reason being that this was the last account record or account type loaded into the application at an entity level. If I minimize this, I will now see that I have a contact entity type, which is going to show me kind of my Nancy stuff and the logical name of the item that's gone into here. If I then go into account contact, this is now going to show me the last contact that was loaded into the account hosted control, and this shows me the last account loaded into the hosted control. And these are all available parameters. These are all replacement parameters that I could define. I could define, an account hosted control name parameter, which would pull the item from the last item loaded into that hosted control, or I could do it at an entity type level. But what's important to understand here is what's being loaded in those three different types. Because a lot of times I'll see people pulling stuff from the hosted control and then they realize that that's not giving them what they need. Sometimes they need to pull the information in from the entity type. And that's an experimental thing. As you experiment with that a little bit, you'll start to see exactly how that information comes within the context of the application. But it gives you the idea to see specifically what's taking place. But if the thing I like to tell people is if things don't seem to be acting the way you want them to act, this is a great way that you can go in and just kind of get an idea as to what's currently loaded into here and then define what you want to do from that point moving forward. Understanding what's going on is critical. And so as you're building these solutions and you're adding these hosted controls and you're generating these action calls and you're firing these action calls based upon specific events and you're using your navigation rules to control what's being brought into the application, as we've kind of talked about throughout the course of this module, it's important to understand that things aren't always going to go right. Things are not going to work exactly how you intended. Something might hiccup, something might not load the way that it's supposed to. And so it's important to be able to understand exactly what caused that to not work the way that we wanted to and how we want to address that. And that's really what we wanted to focus on in this module. And that's really where the debugger comes in. Remember, the debugger is kind of your primary first point of contact. That is the area that is going to allow most of your administrators to go in and see what's happening. You can look at all of your individual action calls and you can see if they fired successfully, if they didn't fire successfully, and what may have been the cause from that. If you want to test scriptlets and you want to see what's happening from a scriptlet perspective, you can go in and you can test those scriptlets. But more importantly, and where you'll see that a lot, is if things don't seem to be populating in the way that you'd hoped with, this is where you can go in and you can actually look at the data parameters that are currently loaded into the system. And by looking at the data parameters, now you can start to see what specific data parameters are being used to populate the replacement parameters inside the application. And remember that the data parameters loaded inside the debugger are the currently loaded in the context of what it is that you're trying to do. And that's what's ultimately going to feed into those replacement parameters. Just make sure that you understand that they don't update in real time. So if before you do anything, do a quick refresh of your data parameters to make sure that you have the most recent version of the data parameters, and then you can move forward from there.